issuing policy prescriptions, when you start advising heads of state, you no longer have the luxury of only being judged on how you think your ideas will affect the world. You begin having to contend with how they actually affect the world, even when that reality contradicts all of your utopian theories. So to quote Friedman's great intellectual nemesis, John Kenneth Galbraith, Milton Friedman's misfortune is that his policies have been tried.
Naomi Klein, author of the best-selling book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, will come back to her speech at the University of Chicago in a minute.
Something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there. He's telling me I've got to beware. It's time to stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. You say it right. I know how to feel there for heat. Hundreds of thousands of people are here in the street. We're singing songs and carrying signs. Mostly saying hooray for our side. It's time to stop. Hey, what's that sound? Look going around.
Now, Bonnie Wright singing for What It's Worth. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report is a return to Naomi Klein, best-selling author of The Shock Doctrine, talking at the University of Chicago on Wednesday about the current economic crisis and the legacy of Milton Friedman.
This process of measuring an elegant, perfect, beautiful, inspiring ideology against a messy reality is a painful process, and it's a process that anyone who has tried to free themselves from the confines of fundamentalist thinking, from ideological constraints, has faced. My grandparents, for instance, were pretty hardcore Marxists. In the 30s and 40s, they believed fervently in the dream of egalitarianism that the Soviet Union represented. They had their illusions shattered by the reality of gulags, of extreme repression, hypocrisy, Stalin's pact with Hitler. I bring this up because the left has been held accountable for the crimes committed in the name of its extreme ideologies. And I believe that it's actually been a very healthy process for the left, one that isn't over, it is continuing. But I think that the process of having to examine the unacceptable compromises that were made in the name of hard ideology, that they're paying off in the way the left today is being reborn and reimagined. You know, the most left-wing place on the planet at the moment is, interestingly enough, the first place where Chicago school ideology made that leap from the textbook into the real world, and that's Latin America. And that happened for a very specific reason, as you know. In the 1950s, there was great concern at the State Department about the fact that Latin America, then as now, as it seems to do, was moving to the left. There was concern about what they called the pink economists, the rise of developmentalism, import substitution, and of course socialism. And of course this was a concern because it greatly affected American and European interests, because the crux of the argument of import substitution was that countries like Chile and Argentina, Guatemala should stop exporting their raw natural resources to the north and then importing expensive processed goods to the south. That it didn't make economic sense, that they should use the same tools of protectionism, of state supports that built the economies of Europe and North America. That was that crazy radical idea. And it was unacceptable. So this plan was between the head of USAID's Chile office and the head of the University of Chicago's economics department to try to change the debate in Latin America, starting in Chile, because that's where developmentalism had gained its deepest roots. And the idea was to bring a group of Chilean students to the University of Chicago to study under a group of economists who were considered so extreme that they were on the margins of the discussion in the United States, which of course at the time in the 1950s was fully in the grips of Keynesianism. But the idea was that there would be, this would be a battle to a counterbalance to the emergence of left-wing ideas in Latin America, that they would go home and counterbalance the pink economists. And so the Chicago Boys were born. And it was considered a success, and the Ford Foundation got in on the funding, and hundreds of Latin American students on full scholarships came to the University of Chicago in the 1950s and 60s to study here, to try to engage in what Juan Gabriel Valdez, Chile's foreign minister after the dictatorship finally ended, described as a project of deliberate ideological transfer, taking these extreme right ideas that were seen as marginal even in the United States and transplanting them to Latin America. That was his phrase. That is his phrase. But today we see that these ideas are re-emerging in Latin America. They were suppressed with force, overthrown with military coups, and then Chile and Argentina, Uruguay and Brazil all became to varying degrees laboratories for the ideas that were taught in the classrooms of the University of Chicago. But now, because there was never a democratic consent for this, the ideas are re-emerging. But one of the things that's interesting about the new left in Latin America is that democracy is at the very center. And, the first thing that Rafael Correa did when he was elected president of Ecuador, for instance, well, the first thing he did was give an interview. They said, "What can we expect of your economic program?" He said, "Well, let's put it this way, I'm no fan of Milton Friedman's." And then he called the Constituent Assembly. He created an incredibly open political process to rewrite the country's constitution. And that's what happened in Bolivia, and that's what's happened in many Latin American countries, because democracy is being put at the center of these projects, because there has been a learning process of looking at the mistakes that the left has made in the past. The ends justify the means mistakes. So I think all ideologies should be held accountable for the crimes committed in their names. I think it makes us better. And of course, there are still those on the far left who will insist that all of those crimes were just an aberration. Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot. Reality is annoying, and they retreat into their sacred texts. We all know who I'm talking about. But lately, particularly just in the past few months, I've noticed something similar happening on the far libertarian right at places like the Cato Institute and the Reason Foundation. It's a kind of a panic, and it comes from the fact that the Bush administration adopted so much of their rhetoric, the fusing of free markets and free people, the championing of so many of their pet policies. But of course, Bush is the worst thing that has ever happened to believers in this ideology, because while parroting the talking points of Friedmanism, he has overseen an explosion of crony capitalism. They treat governing as a conveyor belt or an ATM machine where private corporations make withdrawals of government in the form of no-bid contracts and then pay back government in the form of campaign contributions. We're seeing this more and more. The Bush administration is a nightmare for these guys, the explosion of the debt. And now, of course, these massive bailouts. So what we see from the ideologues of the far right, by far right I mean the far economic right, frantically distancing themselves and retreating to their sacred text, the road to serfdom, capitalism and freedom, free to choose. So that's why I've taken to calling them right-wing Trump